This is Gretchen Godfrey from Pacer Center, and I want to thank all of you for joining us on today's webinar, Family Matters, a family-focused introduction to accessible instructional materials. And before I turn things over to Joy for the presentation, I'm going to cover a few logistics. First of all, once again, a reminder that all participants will be muted for the duration of the call. If you are listening through your computer, be sure to, or through your phone, be sure to mute your computer speakers to avoid hearing an echo. And if you do experience any issues with the sound quality through your computer, you might want to try calling into the 1-800 number instead. You can use the question and answer box in the go-to toolbar that's on the right side of your screen to ask your questions. Generally, we'll be saving questions until the end of the presentation, but if there is some clarifying piece of information that you'd like to know, please feel free to type that in, and we can stop if necessary. We do have over 80 people registered for today's event, so we'll answer as many questions as we can in the time frame we have and try to follow up with you afterwards if necessary, if we did not have a chance to get to your questions. You should have also all received a copy of today's PowerPoint via email. It would have come from Gretchen Godfrey in your inbox yesterday, so if for some reason, if you want to print it out to take notes or anything, you have access to the information that way. And then also, we at Pacer and our presenter, we all value your feedback, so I will be emailing a link to an evaluation of today's webinar later this afternoon, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would take the time to complete that. So with that, I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Joy Zabala, who is Technical Assistance Director for the National Center on Accessible Instructional Materials at CAST, where she has worked for the past 3 years or so. Joy is a general and special educator who has spent over 25 years conducting professional development and training for students, families, education agencies, organizations, companies, and others across the U.S. and abroad to expand the use of assistive technology as a means to increase the communication, participation, and productivity of people with disabilities. Joy is also a frequent presenter on assistive technology decision-making, implementation, and evaluation of effectiveness, and also presents on universal design for learning. So with that, Joy, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Gretchen, and thank you all for coming together. I will give you a bit of a caveat to begin with, is that sometimes this particular type of presentation almost feels like a fire hose being turned on you. It has so much information in it. However, hopefully I can give you a basis for thinking about and working with families and students about accessible instructional materials. Certainly don't hesitate to type your questions in, and Gretchen, don't hesitate to just speak up when one comes along. I'm going to begin with, let me see, click. Go. Okay. The main ideas in this particular presentation are the legal mandate to ensure provision of accessible instructional materials, and talk a little bit about what some of the terms are, and I hope clear up some of the myths, I think, that are the misunderstandings about accessible instructional material. We'll touch briefly on pedagogical concerns, which are beyond the legal issues, and then we're going to spend time talking about the sources of specialized formats, the qualifications for each source, and information about some of the AIM Center resources. Our second webinar that's coming up in November is really very much about the AIM Center resources and others, so we'll just be touching on those today. So let's start with the legal and pedagogical issues. There are provisions within the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, which was passed in 1904, I just lost a decade right there, 2004, that requires state and local education agencies to ensure that textbooks and related core instructional materials are provided to students with print disabilities in specialized formats in a timely manner. That obviously is not the actual wording in Section 301.72 of the final regulations, but that's a synopsis of what that part means. And what happens, usually when people look at this, they say, oh my, there are a lot of terms in there that are particularly either elusive or troubling. So I'll try to get to let you know a bit about what some of those things mean. First, let's talk about the legal connections. In order to do this, to make sure that students have the accessible instructional materials they need, state and local education agencies are required to adopt the NIMAS. The NIMAS is the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard. And many of you may have heard about accessible instructional materials as the NIMAS. And keep in mind, though, that that is a standard. It's not a particular thing. It's a group of tags, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So in order to adopt the NIMAS, what that means that state and local education agencies have to do is that they have to include the requirement to produce a file that is marked up to the NIMAS standard in all of their purchasing contracts. This is very important because many people think that publishers are required to create these files and make them available. But there is no statutory requirement based on publishers because the Office of Special Education Programs in the U.S. Department of Education do not have jurisdiction over publishers. They require state and local education agencies to do different things. But they are not the ones who, but there is no mandate. So what happens is that state and local education agencies, by putting the requirement to provide that file in their purchasing contracts, make the creation and deposit and availability of these files available as a part of the doing business by a publisher. So that's, I think, probably one of the most important, not the most important, but one of the most important things to know is that publishers are not required to do this unless state and local education agencies require them to create these files. So this is something state and local education agencies are getting better and better at doing, but it is taking a while to make that happen. Publishers could say, no, I'm not going to create that file. But if they do, then certainly the hope is that state and local education agencies will say, well, we're going to have to find someone who will. So that's an important part of what we're doing. The second thing they have to do is decide whether to coordinate with the NIMAC. The NIMAC is the National Instructional Materials Access Center. This is the place where the publishers, when they create those NIMAS compliant source files, deposit them so that state and local education agencies can use those files to create materials for students so that they can indeed provide specialized formats in a timely manner to qualified students. At present, all 50 states have agreed to coordinate with the NIMAC, which is a good thing because that is one of the main sources of these kinds of materials for students who qualify. So if you think back to what we said at the very beginning about students, and what we're required to do, what state and local education agencies are required to do. The term core-related instructional materials was used in that little phrase. Also specialized formats, NIMAS, timely manner, and print disabilities. And frequently, people really have a lot of questions about all of those things. So what are related core materials? I think we all know what textbooks are. The related core materials are those items that are published with textbooks. When people make purchases, you often, in addition to a textbook, you have the opportunity to purchase workbooks and supplementary readers and those kinds of things. Those are the related core materials. And if those materials are written and published primarily for use in elementary and secondary school instruction, and if they're required by a state or local education agency for use by students in the classroom, then those are the materials to which this particular mandate applies. Now, I think one of the important things that we want to think about, too, though, is when we talk about textbooks and core-related materials, if those are needed in a specialized format, it's very likely that students are going to need other things in a specialized format as well. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So one of the things that has been misunderstood often is there's a piece in the mandate that says that printed textbooks and related core materials that are published after July 19, 2006 need to have these files. One of the things that I think probably was not known at the beginning of this particular initiative was that there are different interpretations of the word published. I guess I always thought that you opened the flyleaf and you looked at the back and it said, you know, published on such and such a date. And yet that's not necessarily the case, that publishers do not always see that particular date as the publication date. The Office of Special Education Programs has interpreted published, because it's in their law, to mean available for purchase. And that means available for purchase directly from the publisher or the publisher's agent. It doesn't mean that you would go to a used bookseller, perhaps, and purchase those materials. But if the publisher is still selling the material after July 19th, 2006, then that is a material for which state and local education agencies could request that a NIMAS compliant source file be created and deposited in the NIMAC. So what are specialized formats? Specialized formats are basically Braille, large print, audio, and digital. And keep in mind that these 4 formats are what can be created from a single NIMAS compliant source file. These are the formats that would be used by a student. People will often say, well, gee, why can't you just use a regular NIMAS file? Well, you can, but basically what the student needs is just the specialized format that's created from that file. That file has to be transformed into a student-ready specialized format. So students do not typically use NIMAS source files. They use a transformation of the NIMAS source file, which would be in Braille, large print, audio, or digital. The thing that's important to keep in mind that when we think about specialized formats, we're thinking about the same information in a different delivery system. And I'll give you an example of this. If we were all reading from the same material, and several of us were using the print books, and someone else was using a specialized format of the book in Braille, another person was using a specialized format of large print, 2 or 3 people were using audio, and several others were using digital text. And Gretchen said to us, okay, I'd like you to all turn to page 62, second paragraph, and we'll all read out loud together. That we would all be able to read out loud together because we would have exactly the same information. It would just be delivered to us in a different format depending on our particular needs and abilities. So I think that's probably one of the things that's important to know. So you've heard about NIMAS. What is NIMAS? A NIMAS source file is an XML, extensible markup language file that is developed with the tags in it that are a part of the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards. That particular source file can be readily transformed into those 4 student-ready specialized formats we were just talking about: Braille, large print, audio, or digital. Then you come to, well, what does timely manner mean? Basically, one of the things that is required of states is to define the term timely manner. But generally, what states how states have defined that is to mean at the same time as other students receive their core instructional materials in print format. Many states have also included a small caveat that says to the greatest extent possible, and that doesn't mean that it's okay to just have delays and not address them. But what it does mean is there may be instances, especially when you're thinking about the specialized format of Braille, when it takes a little bit longer to get that specialized format. If a student moves into a district who needs a specialized format, it's very unlikely that that format will be available the next day, even though everyone has their core instructional materials in print format. However, if there are delays, then state and local education agencies are expected to address those delays and try to lower those barriers so that future delays do not occur. And then what is a print disability? Basically, it depends. I think probably all of you are aware that print disability is not one of the disability categories under IDEA. A print disability is a functional issue that may occur because of a variety of disability categories. Basically, it means that a person is not able to use print effectively to gain information and then use that information for educational participation and productivity. That's why the "it depends" is there. Different people are interpreting print disability in a different way, but primarily the main thing to think about is that it is a functional disability, the function of using and gaining meaning from print. And if that is not something that a student is able to do, and they are a student serves under IDEA, then one of the specialized formats may very well be required, one or more of the specialized formats. So I'd like us to think about this question, because this is one that probably is already in your minds, and you're probably wondering why I haven't addressed this yet. Who qualifies for specialized formats? What I'd like you to do is to reframe that question at this particular time and think about who needs specialized formats, because there's not a qualification for specialized formats. We're going to talk about qualification later, but we want to make sure that we're talking about qualification in the place where it should be talked about, and that is, where can we get the specialized formats that this particular student needs? That's where your qualification comes in. So we would like to just do away with the whole language that says who qualifies for specialized formats, because there is not a qualification for specialized formats per se, although there are qualifications for several of the places you can get specialized formats. So before we go into the next part, I thought I'd ask Gretchen, are there any questions that anybody, or clarifications that anybody has asked for at this point?
So far there are not, so I'll just remind everyone that they can, type in questions whenever they have them, but right now we do not have any.
Okay, fine. So let's talk a little bit about the pedagogical concerns and connections to this. And I'm going to use Universal Design for Learning as my frame, because the whole idea of Universal Design for Learning is that the learning environment's goals, instruction, materials, and assessment are flexible enough and broad enough so that everyone can move forward towards reaching those goals. And when we think about accessible instructional materials, obviously the materials part of the materials part would be the very important part that we look at, making those materials as flexible as possible. And as we move forward, one of the things that we want to think about is, while there are some students who require accessible instructional materials to even participate and achieve, there are many other students who may elect or prefer to use at certain times for certain tasks materials in formats other than print. I don't know about you all, but I listen to audible.com quite a lot, because it makes people unhappy if you're reading while you're driving. But listening while you're driving seems to be certainly an acceptable thing to do. So when we think about the tasks for which in which a student is expected to read, we also want to think about the effective material, the effective way that they could get that information. I think often about the number of students who spend long hours or long minutes on buses in the morning and in the afternoon, and how access to their materials sometimes in a different format might be very useful to them. Universal Design for Learning places a lot of emphasis on the use of digital technology along with other strategies and materials as a way to support the diversity of learners. However, one of the things that we need to be aware of is that all digital materials are not accessible. And I think there's this idea that if we just had everything digitally, that it would be usable and accessible to everyone. And that's not necessarily the case. And the reason I mention this, particularly from a family perspective, is that often what happens is someone asks, are the materials accessible? And the answer is yes, they're digital. So digital materials, in what format and to whom are they accessible? All digital materials are not marked up to the NIMAS standard, so they cannot be readily transformed into other types of formats. So we just need to be aware of that as we move forward. So this is the part now that we'll start talking in just a moment about who qualifies. But right now let's look at the variety of sources for acquiring accessible instructional materials. There are basically 5 big categories of sources. One of those sources is the NIMAC, the National Instructional Materials Access Center, where the NIMAS compliant source files that are produced by publishers those files are placed in the NIMAC, and then state and local education agencies are actually the authorized users designated by state education agencies can get those files and download those files for transformation locally, or what has been certainly much more useful, I think, in most states, is that they assign those files to accessible media producers. What the accessible media producer is takes the source file and creates the student-ready version so that schools can download those very quickly without having to worry about transformation on their own. So accessible media producers that you might be familiar with are Bookshare, Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic, the American Printing House for the Blind are three big ones that receive a great deal of federal funds to actually make this happen so that schools can provide these materials in a timely manner. However, there are also, I think, literally hundreds of accessible media producers who may transform materials, not just from NIMAS files, but from a variety of sources, including scanning a paper book and turning that into a digital format that could then be transformed. There are still places, lots of places, where Braille is produced by someone actually keying in the Braille characters. So all of that is done by accessible media producers, which we call the AMPs. There's a great relationship at this point between the NIMAC and the accessible media producers. So the NIMAC is that library of those NIMAS compliant files, and the accessible media producers are the ones who change and transform those files into Braille, large print, digital, and audio files. Please be aware, though, that all accessible media producers do not necessarily produce the same formats. And there is a document on the AIM Center website called the AIM Guide to Federally Funded Accessible Media Producers. It doesn't exactly just roll off the tongue, does it? But that particular guide shows a side-by-side of Bookshare, Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic, and the American Printing House for the Blind, and lets you know fairly quickly which formats come from which place, about how long it takes, which students are eligible to receive materials from those particular sources. So it's a very, very nice resource. The next source is commercial sources, the things that can be purchased. And this is where we certainly hope that there will be a lot of movement in the next little while. There's already been some movement. Some publishers are actually creating digital files that can be purchased just in the same way and for the same price as a print book, so that when someone goes to order instructional materials, they could designate how many print copies they want, how many digital copies they want. And then the digital copies, the particular one I'd like to mention, Pearson Publishing has what they call HTML books, a series of HTML books, and what those books are designed not to add anything to the print book, but rather to have a digital version that will work with whatever assistive technology an individual happens to be using. So they're very flexible types of materials that work very much like the same way your browser works on your computer. So commercial sources are beginning to emerge, and we have great hope that they will emerge much quicker as we move forward and as people ask for them. One of the things that has been a problem thus far is that publishers have said, you know, no one's asking for these kinds of materials, and we need to up the frequency with which those kinds of materials are asked for, because I think not only does it help with providing specialized formats in a timely manner under the law, but it also helps with simply the availability of flexible materials that could be used by anyone. Then there are the free sources, and free sources means that you can download them from the web, you can get them from other places. The limitation of the free sources, however, is that usually it's not textbooks and related instructional materials that are available for free, although there has been some movement in that direction too with open source materials. And then there's the one that people like me who have spent a lot of time in assistive technology have spent a lot of time doing what we call do-it-yourself, that you people scan the materials and change them into another format that can be used by a student. And while I think there will probably always be times when you must do it yourself, what we want to make sure that we do is that we don't do it ourselves when there are other readily available sources. And there's quite a number of reasons for that, one of which is the time that it takes to make that happen, and another is the accuracy that it takes if you're going to actually produce usable textbooks yourself from a print textbook. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it may not be as good a product as we hope we could get from some of the other sources. So then we come to the question that probably all of you have been waiting for. You thought you were perhaps waiting for who qualifies for accessible instructional materials or what are eligibility. But remember that, excuse me, just one moment. What we're actually talking about is eligibility for sources of accessible instructional materials. So I'll ask one more time, are there any questions that anybody has at this point, Gretchen?
People are being really shy today, so we have no questions yet.
People, I know it's not because this is so clear that there are no questions, because this is a complex issue, and it would be perfectly reasonable to have a good bit of confusion. I would almost say if you're not confused at this point, you may not be listening. So it's not that I'm trying to confuse you. It's just that there are issues related to what education requires us to do and issues about what copyright makes it very difficult for us to do. So let's look at the NIMAC. The NIMAC, what you see on your screen right now is if you go to nimac.us, it doesn't have an org ending on it, nimac.us, you can actually search the NIMAC to see if the book that you're looking for, anybody can do this, a school, a family, and see if the book is there in the NIMAC. However, only, as I mentioned a little bit ago, only authorized users designated by the State Department of Education can actually go and get those materials out of the NIMAC and transform them into student-ready versions. The reason for this is that that's a way to protect the digital rights of the publisher. Because these particular items that are in the NIMAC are furnished free of charge. The federal law requires that materials be made available to students, or actually to individuals. It's not really about students, to individuals with who are blind or have other print-related disabilities in a timely manner, free of charge. So that's one of the reasons why there are some limitations as we go along. I personally, when I first started working in this, did not know that and couldn't figure out why it wasn't just okay, because I thought that if I downloaded it, I would pay for it the same amount I'd pay for a book, which is not the case. So know that the NIMAC is there. It is, again, as I said, the primary repository for NIMAS compliant source files. So who qualifies for specialized formats that are created from these NIMAS compliant files that are sent through the NIMAC? There are two qualifications, and this is really, really important. If materials that are created from a NIMAS source file, that comes through the NIMAC, students have to have two qualifications. They have to be a student with a disability who is served under IDEA. Okay? They also have to be a person who is eligible under the Copyright Act of 1931 as amended. Some of you may have heard the term Chafee eligible. Chafee was the latest amendment to the 1931 Copyright Act, which is the act to provide books to the adult blind, which obviously has changed a good bit in terms of whom and what disabilities. They have to be certified by a competent authority as being unable to read or use printed materials because of blindness, a visual impairment, physical limitations, or an organic dysfunction. So there's the two prongs of being able to use materials that were created from NIMAS files through the NIMAC. A student with a disability served under IDEA, and a student who is eligible under the Copyright Act and has been certified by a competent authority as being unable to read print materials because of one of those four disability categories. Now, let me tell you just real quickly, one of the questions in a lot of people's mind is, what if a student is not served under IDEA? What if they're a student who's blind In other words, they qualify under the Copyright Act for these materials, but they are not served under IDEA. They still need specialized formats, but the NIMAC cannot be used as a source of those materials. And keep in mind, it isn't that students ever receive something directly from the NIMAC, but if one of the transformed materials came through that NIMAC source, then those materials cannot be used for those students. This has been one of the real dilemmas in moving this initiative forward.
Joy, one question that came in on that definition, if we could talk about
okay, great.
In terms of being unable to read, the question was, is that just unable to read the print, or because does comprehension of the print material come into play for that definition?
Well, I think that would be, that's the it depends part, is that the important thing to think about, it could be a perceptual or processing issue. That would be perhaps under organic dysfunction. But what we have to be aware of is that the specialized format, remember, is the analog. It's exactly the same information. And if a student has a cognitive disability that would make that material not understandable or not readily understandable to that student without some sort of modification of the content, not just the way it's delivered, then that's not what the NIMAS file is going to be. That's not what's going to be coming through the NIMAC. So that's one of the hard parts. Is it certainly could be a perceptual or a processing issue that would cause the person not to understand. But what we have to think about is, would that person understand exactly the same material if they heard it, or if chances are you wouldn't be looking at Braille or large print, but if they heard it or if they saw it digitally, and that would be the question: is does the material itself, the content itself, need to be modified in some way, or would another kind of material be more appropriate? Whoever asked that question, does that make sense? I think that's an excellent, excellent question, because one of the things that people often look at when they see this particular definition is, but wait a minute, what if someone has another sort of disability? Does that mean that this automatically does not apply to them? Keep in mind that what we have to think about here is, does a student's disability impact their ability to gain meaning from print? If so, if that material, that same material, was delivered in a different way, would it be usable to that individual student? I think one of the things that is of concern is the idea that if it were only digital, then everything would be fine, and certainly we don't want to undersupply specialized formats to people, but nor do we want to supply specialized formats and think that that's going to work when that's not the issue. I hope that makes sense. It's certainly not a thought to deny anybody access to specialized formats, but just to make sure that people have the materials they need. So
right. I got some positive feedback from the person who asked that. So
okay, great.
But thanks. I did. A couple people did ask if you could talk a little bit more about what organic dysfunction means.
Oh, sure. Actually, organic dysfunction is another one of those wonderful undefined terms, very much like print disability. In the statutes themselves, print disability is not defined, and an organic dysfunction is not defined. Basically, if you look up what an organic dysfunction is, it says a dysfunction of a major organ or system of organs in the body. And so there are lots of people who say, well, wait a minute, wouldn't that be physical? And I think probably the original intent, or many people would tell you that the original intent of this particular statute, that physical limitations was basically motor limitations, the inability to hold a book, to sit upright for the length of time it took to read, to things that were actually motoric in nature, and that organic dysfunction would be those processing type issues that learning disabilities perhaps that relate that would impede a person's ability to process and gain meaning from print, even though they could see it and manipulate it and all of that. However, that term is not defined, and the only reason it really makes any difference is because blindness, visual impairment, and physical limitations, that competent authority is basically many people, often who are employed by the school district. Organic dysfunction, in order to be certified by a competent authority as a student who has a reading disability based on organic dysfunction, can only be done by a doctor of medicine. And I'm waiting a second because I'm sure some of you are going, what? So I think one of the things, though, that as we begin to look at this in depth, for a student to be served as a student who is blind or has a visual impairment, or who's served perhaps under one of the categories that would take in physical limitation, generally requires a doctor's some sort of I want to say a note, that's not right, but a diagnosis so that the student can actually be served in those ways. That's not required for learning disabilities and some of the other categories. So in some ways, the physician has been involved probably in all of these at some point. But do know that there is tremendous differences in interpretation around the country. You would definitely want to check with the NIMAS coordinator in your state to see how this plays out in your state and how that would happen in the discussion. You can find your NIMAS coordinator at aim.cas.org. There's a place where it says, it talks about specific states, and you could find that there in that spot. So let's look really quickly at the eligibility for the other sources of AIM. Accessible media producers, and this is often a confusion for people because they think that the qualifications for accessible media producers are different than those of the NIMAC, and indeed they are. Basically, the general collection of accessible media producers are individuals who are eligible under the copyright statute, because accessible media producers are able to produce materials for anyone from birth to death who requires printed materials in an accessible format. However, accessible media producers who get materials from the NIMAC, either because they have been designated as an authorized user by their state Department of Education, excuse me, or because an authorized user has assigned the file to them for transformation. For that particular collection, which is where most of the textbooks and related core materials sit, it has exactly the same qualifications that the NIMAC itself has. So there's not a difference there, although there may be some little difference in how those last pieces, when I talked about organic dysfunction and physical disabilities, how those are actually interpreted by the accessible media producers. There are also commercial sources, which I talked about earlier, and of course the great advantage of commercial sources is that purchase it for anyone and use it with anyone. You don't have to be concerned at all about who qualifies for what. If it was purchased, then it can be used by anybody. The key thing, though, there is purchased for anyone, used with anyone. So if you think about the one, if we purchase 10 digital copies of a material, we can't give those 10 digital copies to 100 people to read. We have to use them only with 10 people. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then there are, of course, the free sources, which also would have no limitation. So I want to use a little graphic illustration here that may be useful. It seemed to help a lot of people. If you think about entering the library of accessible text from the left-hand side of your screen, you see that everybody can go in that first room, and that room is where the free and fee-based resources, things that are purchased from publishers, purchased from other sources, free, web-based, anybody can use those materials. If a student is copyright exempt, in other words, if they have been certified by a competent authority as having a print disability as defined by copyright statute, they can get materials from accessible media producers. That's the mandate of accessible media producers. People who have, whether they're students or not, are eligible to receive these materials with an exemption from copyright, especially for students with disabilities that are print disabilities. That would be Bookshare, RFB&D, the Accessible Book Collection, the American Printing House for the Blind, and on and on. Then, if a student is also served under IDEA, they can enter the third room, and that's where the NIMAC materials are, the materials that are sourced through the NIMAC. So that doesn't look too bad because there's 4 boxes in the first room, 4 boxes in the second room, and just 1 additional box in the third room. However, when we think about core instructional materials and textbooks, currently there's a much, much more robust set of those materials in the NIMAC that are available to a few students who meet both of those criteria than they are in either of the other sources. Now keep in mind, you can look at this and say, but wait a minute, there's lots and lots of stuff at Bookshare, there's lots and lots of stuff at RFB&D. Indeed, but remember, if they're textbooks and related core materials, then those have the same restrictions, if you will, as the NIMAC. The students to receive those materials have to be not only copyright exempt, but also be served under IDEA. But the good thing is that we're really looking at the library of the accessible library of the near future, where there would be robust sources of materials, not only for students who are served under IDEA and copyright exempt, but also robust materials that are available through accessible media producers, and a robust set of materials that are available for purchase or for free. And I think we would probably look at the market model, which is what we call the for purchase part, as that robust source in that regard. Some things to remember. If a student is not served under IDEA and copyright eligible, those source files may not be accessed through the NIMAC to create materials for those students. And if an IEP team determines that a student needs materials in a specialized format, but the student is not eligible under copyright or not served under IDEA, then you need to check back with your state system, and that would be through your NIMAS coordinator primarily, though you certainly would want to inquire in your district first, to provide guidance on how to acquire those materials. Are those materials available for purchase? Are they available in some other way? Do they have to be internally produced? And keep in mind that the example of AIM Center there doesn't mean that the AIM Center produces those. It means that there may be some sort of accessible instructional materials local production, even though that has generally not been a particularly effective and efficient way to do this. And then, of course, there's always the do-it-yourself. That's basically the internally produced. But we want to keep in mind that when you do it yourself, if you transform them yourself, you still have the same responsibility to protect copyright if it is a copyrighted material. That would be the case for any other published material. So if you're doing it yourself, producing a teacher-made test in a specialized format by scanning it or typing it in Braille or whatever, that's not a problem. But if indeed it's a copyrighted material that you are transforming into another format, then that is a problem unless the student is qualified. And I'll give you an example. Let's say I have a first grade reading book, and I have a student who has a print disability, and so I am going to transform by scanning that particular book into let's say, a digital format for that student, so that that student can not only see the information but also hear it at the same time. I can't then take that same material that I've produced and use it with all the rest of my first graders, unless they have the same qualifications that that student had. Nor can I take that material and give it to my granddaughter who's in the first grade, because it would be really interesting and nice for her to read that too. So we do have that responsibility to protect copyright. So any questions now before we start this last little piece?
One question that kind of goes back to the different types of specialized formats. Someone asked about the NIMAS files. Does the format require that the student has access to a computer for all subjects where they've had a textbook that's been modified into the NIMAS format?
Now keep in mind that the textbook is not going to be modified in, well, okay, let me see. if the student is using the digital student-ready format, this is really not about the NIMAS file. This is about the format that the student is actually using. That, except in the case of embossed Braille, which means basically printed Braille, or large print, which by definition is a hard copy, you're going to need something for this format to ride on. It doesn't mean that necessarily that the student is going to need a computer everywhere or that a laptop computer is the right thing, but there would have to be some decision making about what technology would render that material useful to the student. So that would be a discussion in the decision making. That's actually quite a nice little segue into the next part. So, any other questions around that same thing?
It looks like you've covered the other questions so far.
Okay. I think one of the things that's hard for us a lot of times is to realize that there's a decision-making process that has to be thought through, and that happens at all stages. We have to first think about a student's need, select what they need, acquire what they need, and then acquire or think about or select what they need in order to use the particular format effectively and efficiently. So let's look at the responsibilities of decision-making teams. The first thing, remember, and I think this is one of the things that comes up in IEP meetings, someone will say, oh, does John qualify for accessible instructional materials? And I hope what you know today is that's not the question. The question is, does John need instructional materials in specialized formats? In other words, is John not able to use and benefit from print materials, but needs that information in the print materials in some other format? So that's our first step. Does he need them? The second step then is to select the formats, if indeed the student does need them, select the formats that are needed by the student for participation and achievement. It's important to know that there is an S there because very often a student will use more than one format depending on the task and depending on the environment. Once the formats have been decided upon, then you go ahead with the state and local education agency defined steps to acquire the needed formats in a timely manner. And then the last part, which is happening basically at the same time that you're acquiring them, is to determine the supports that are needed for effective use for educational participation and achievement. If I'm going to use a digital format, then I have to have some sort of technology that will render that format, and that format has to be, that technology has to be something that I can actually work with, read fairly easily. That if the thing that is rendering the content, if I don't know how to use that, then that would keep me also from achieving. So we'd be looking at not only the technology, but also what sort of training do I need? What sort of supports do I need? And not just me, the student, but me, the people around the student who are helping the student. Are there other accommodations and modifications that might need to be in place so that I can use or learn to use these formats for participation and achievement? So all of those things are part of the decision-making possibilities. And we've got, I want to take you very quickly to aim.cas.org and show you a couple of things that I'd like you to look at. We're going to, as I said, in the next session, we'll be going very, very deeply into some of these things. But for right now, I think it should be coming to, there it is, okay. You'll notice if you look at the website, that's exactly what you see live on your screen right now. See where it says AIM in your state over on the right-hand side where my cursor is? That's how you can select your state and go to that state and see who your NIMAS coordinator is. You can usually find out a great deal about a website in your state that will give you a lot of information. That's one thing that's important. Actually, there's tons that's important here. But one of the other things I'd like to point out to you is the item at the very top on the right, and that's the Stay Connected. The AIM Center has a newsletter every month called the AIM Connector, and the AIM Connector highlights resources, highlights ideas that are to be thought about, lets you know what's coming up. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're
Hello?
coming through.
Oh, because my computer just popped up that the audio connection had been lost.
Oh, I am still hearing you.
Okay.
At least through the phone.
I hope the others who are VoIP are not now wondering what's happened to the audio connection. But those are two main things. And if you, as I scroll down, let's see if it scrolls down. Okay. It scrolls down, you'll see there are highlights from the field, which is a lot of information from the field. There are also the upcoming events that you see on the left side, and quick links, and then there's stakeholder-focused AIM resources. You'll notice there that there is a section for parents and students and teachers. What all of these, the focus on stakeholders is just really to say, on this website, here may be some things that you're especially interested in. There's nothing on this website that is specifically for one group and not for another, but it just gives you some ideas of things that might be things that you would like to read. I'm going to take you quickly to experience because I'd like you to know about the AIM Navigator and the AIM Explorer. The decision-making tools section, the AIM Navigator and the AIM Explorer are two tools that are very useful to people who are attempting to make decisions about those areas that I just mentioned. The AIM Navigator has all kinds of support for making those kinds of decisions, and I would urge you all to look more closely at it and to tell you that we will definitely be looking more closely at it in the next webinar. Very quickly, I'll take you there. We'll go right to the tool online, and I know that I'm jumping all around, but I want to move quickly to this. Basically, what the Navigator does is it asks a series of questions and provides support so that teams can answer those questions. The Navigator does not make decisions. It provides support so that individuals can make decisions. So let's look very quickly at need. It also produces a very nice report because it collects everything that is put in as you go along. So let's say we're doing this and we're trying to think if this person needs accessible instructional materials, and we look at the three questions and we say, same content, one or more specialized formats, but we don't know what specialized formats are. Go over to the right-hand side. You see the questions, what are specialized formats? And you click it, and it gives you some information on what a specialized format is. The idea here is we anticipated frequently asked questions, and then we also provided, in case you need more information, a place to go to learn a lot more about need. And this is a very robust list of frequently asked questions. And I'm going to scroll down here. You'll see it going. I don't expect you to be able to read this, so you can find this on the website and read. But I want to get down to the bottom where there are references and resources. So in addition to the frequently asked questions and the answers to those frequently asked questions, there's a robust list of resources, and that's the Tell Me More section. So this particular tool then takes decision makers, and that is generally the IEP team, unless the student is served in some other way besides under IDEA, and that would, the decision-making team then might be a 504 team or some other team, but it takes you through need, it takes you through selection, and it has a place where you put in the actual print materials that are going to be used, then gives you support for thinking about the specialized formats, then it takes you through acquisition, and you think about how is your student served, which then gives you information on which of the acquisition sources can be used for that particular student. And then we go over to use. And when we think about what is needed for the student to use these materials, then we look at the technology. We look at training. And you'll notice that each time I click, the things under Help Me Decide and Tell Me More change because they're different for each screen. When we look at instructional strategies that might be important for a student using this particular format, we think about the support services that would be needed, and we think about accommodations and modifications that would be needed. And then that takes us to the student summary. In this tool, there's also a to-do list so that as we move forward, we can also create a list about what needs to be done, who's going to do it, and when they're going to use it by, and we can save and print that material. So this is just one of the many resources that are available on the AIM Center website to help people not only gain information, but also to learn a lot more about decision making and how how this all works. Whoa, that was not what I intended to do. Sorry, I didn't mean to close the whole thing down. So before we end, let me get back to the slideshow. Before we end, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes on my watch. Anybody has any questions at this point? I'll need about the last minute to close it up. But other than that, Gretchen?
There aren't any questions right now. I'll just ask that people who did type questions, if your question wasn't quite answered thoroughly or if you have any follow-up, please type that in now so that we know that you have further questions. Otherwise, just give people a minute here in case they're thinking of something. One question is, can you think of an example of, in terms of the NIMAS files need to have, the two-pronged eligibility or qualifications met in terms of being served under IDEA and having a print disability. Can you think of an example of someone who would be determined by the team of needing accessible materials but was not determined to have a print disability? What would that look like?
That's a really interesting question, because and this is, you're now asking Joyce Zabala, the person, okay?
Okay.
Because there's a lot of interpretation. It would be very difficult for me to think of someone who needed a specialized format. In other words, who could use exactly the same material in a different format that I would think would not fit in a category that made them eligible under print disability, as a person with print disability. However, let's say you had a student who had a physical disability, and that physical disability did not impact their ability to use printed materials. Simply because they had a print disability, because they had a physical disability doesn't automatically mean that they would need that particular service. So that's not exactly what the question was. Another possible example would be an English language learner, someone who could not use print materials effectively because they didn't know the language, not so much that or perhaps they had not received sufficient instruction in related to literacy. They may be a person with a disability, but that may not be the reason that they are not able to use print. So we have to think about that. I would say if someone actually is a person who has truly a print disability, cannot use print because of a disability, in many cases I would say that most of those students could be qualified as a person with a print disability under IDEA. Under copyright. But that is me. That's not necessarily how every State Department of Education has, or every the legal counsel of a State Department of Education has interpreted this particular statute. I think one of the difficulties is that we really can't interpret statute. All we can say is, here's what it says. What does that mean where you are? And some guidance in that regard is important, because otherwise each IEP team would be on their own trying to determine this, and so the whole idea of equity would be extremely difficult.
All right, let me see if we have any others. It looks like we do not have any other questions at this point.
Okay, I hope that we don't have questions because you're pondering this deeply and not that you've just thought, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. Please know that you can always write to me directly at jzabala@cast.org. You can also write if you go to the AIMS Center site, there are many ways to get in touch with us. We really want people to ask us, and I think that this particular group of folks you have direct access to families. Families are going to be the key to really making a difference here. And I think one of the important things to think about, though, is that the school schools are not trying to withhold information at all. They are also struggling with exactly the same issues that we've been talking about today. It's very unclear how to go about doing this as effectively and efficiently as we know it needs to be done. But the more, again, that idea of asking, making sure that people are aware. If you're in an IEP meeting, you might want to say, let's be sure we explore the possibility that Johnny may need accessible instructional materials. And if the answer that you get is, well, we really don't think he does, you can say, well, let's go look at the AIM Navigator and work through that, as a possibility. Typically not in an IEP meeting because it's a fairly lengthy thing, but one of the things you might want to do is to say, let's explore this and come back and talk about what we find out. And I would say that in large part, this should be done families and schools working together, and very often students working together as well. So Václav Havel, who is one of my current favorite folks to quote, said, "It's not enough to stare up the steps. We must step up the stairs." And what that means, perhaps to us in this situation, is what I'd like to ask you to do to step up the stairs is to explore the National Center on Accessible Instructional Materials website. Go to aim.cas.org and have a look around and see what's there. Try out the AIM Navigator and try out the AIM Explorer. The AIM Explorer is a simulation that lets you try larger prints, smaller prints, different color combinations to make things more usable for an individual. A lot of the different things that can be done with supported reading software, but gives you a place to begin. Sign up for the AIM Connector newsletter. Check out the public webinars and presentations that are done through the AIM Center, which are pretty frequent, and send the family members that you work with to those webinars and those presentations. Find out who the AIM NIMAS coordinator is for your state. Be sure to encourage people to discuss the possible need, keeping in mind possible need, not eligibility for accessible instructional materials in planning and IEP meetings. Be sure to share this information with others. Be sure to ask questions as often as you can, and as much as you can, make sure that you encourage others to do the same. With that in mind, I think there's my web address. And I'd be happy to hear from any of you anytime. And Gretchen can find me if you have any trouble finding me.
All right.
And it's certainly been a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you, and I look forward to taking you on a tour of the AIM Center and providing you with some other resources in our next round.
Yes, thank you very much, Joy. Our next webinar, I believe, is Wednesday, November 10th. I did not look that up ahead of time, but I'm pretty sure that is the date. We'll be sending out the registration the second half of October, and I'll also include the date in the follow-up email to this webinar, just to be sure that you can put it all on your calendars. And this webinar was recorded, and it will be saved on the PACER website, so if you have other staff or want to hear the information again, we will let you all know when that recording is available. And I'll again take the opportunity to remind you to fill out the evaluation form when you receive that via email in the next few hours. So thank you, Joy, for your time very much, and thanks everyone for their participation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.